Day. I was going to actually be meeting with someone else right before this call, and we ended up rescheduling for next week. I'm very excited about this guest. He is going to be coming on Tuesday the 15th. His name is James Valentine, and he was actually a guest of mine on the Knowing podcast. So tune in next Tuesday. We're going to be talking all about actually kind of a continuation of this conversation about the principles that constitute really being an incredible leader, both in the home and also in the workplace. But today we are going to be talking about the principles and practices of what constitutes a strong brand. And y'all, this is a really important conversation, one near and dear to my heart, because branding is actually where I first started as a professional. I didn't end up getting much university training, and I just kind of started learning boots on the street. I'm very much so an experiential learner. And so the process of going through how to cultivate a strong brand is one that I learned firsthand in, kind of my early education in my career, but also it's something that we focus on a lot at the Knowing Agency. And more recently, I have been putting this into practice for myself because I realized it's so much easier. I mean, for all of us, it's so much easier to do the work that we do for our clients for them and not turn it inward and actually practice this. But I realized that I was actually using that as an excuse to not do the work for myself, where it was, I'm so busy serving everyone else and doing all this work for my clients, but I was never actually using it inward. And while my initial excuse was, oh, well, we're so busy, I don't have the time for that, there was a fear that what would happen if I actually tried some of these practices for us internally? What if we actually did the branding, did the marketing that we do for our clients? And, we were doing it for Amazon executives all the way down to local therapists, so it very much so ranged in terms of the executives we were serving with these principles and practices of cultivating a strong brand. But I had never done it for myself in a very intentional way. And even still, we're kind of, it's a slow progression because, we're working on my brand in between working for our clients. But at the same time, when I realized why I wasn't doing the work for myself, that it was predicated in fear, that's when I knew that I actually needed to assume radical responsibility. And I actually posted about this last night, that radical responsibility at the end of the day requires us going inward and knowing the root why for any belief or behavior that we kind of stumble upon. And when I realized that the root why behind my behavior of not investing in myself was predicated in fear, but what if I fail? That's when it was like, okay, now I know that this is something that I really need to spend time on. So over the last couple of months, my team and I have just been discussing and also moving in the direction of, okay, what are our offers going to be? What are the practices that are necessary for us that we've done for our clients? Because there's never a one size fits all. So these principles and practices we'll be talking about here in just a minute about what constitutes a strong brand are never going to be for every single person. Now, that's in regards to the practices, but the principles are very much so core and intrinsic to a strong brand across the board. So with that, I'm going to start talking first about the principles of what constitutes a strong brand. Y'all, the identity of who we are precedes the strategy. And this is why when my team and I have been working for and on my personal brand, we've been realizing that when it comes to our offers, in terms of the hierarchical flow that we want our customers to come through, each one of us needs to be thinking about this on the strategic level. But what we have identified is that this concept of we need to know who we are before we can then put together a strategy about the how to or the execution of, sharing this across social media platforms, website, what's our messaging, all of those very important practices that are necessary for constituting a strong brand. However, the identity of the individual needs to be known from the inside out. And we have to start with knowing. And so that is a core principle of constituting a strong brand, is we have to know who we are. And there's a few different elements in terms of the practice that allow for us to be known, but that is a core principle that does not change regardless of of the individual. And that's where actually I was in when I was at the Golden Swan Mastermind. That's with Nick Peterson, Joe Polish, and Chris Voss. He's the #1 negotiator in the world. And I was at this mastermind a couple months ago, and Nick really drove this point home, which I absolutely loved, was effectively we've got the principle that is applicable in every regard, and then the practices, which is what kind of changes. It's not always going to be the exact same per person, but the principle. That's why it's so critical that we know the principle, and then we can, adapt for the application thereof. So first, the identity precedes the strategy. You need to know who you are in order to thus be able to be known. Because one of the things, and I talked about this when I was on stage at Traffic and Conversion a few years ago, y'all, we need to be known. And the reason for this, it's not just about knowing our customers. It's not just engaging with empathy, but we need to lead with an authenticity, because otherwise empathy becomes manipulation. And so this is why identity of who we are matters so innately. It's like intrinsic to connection with our audience, because otherwise we're going to be manipulative in the manner in which we engage with them. So authenticity is predicated on the depth to which we know who we are to then be able to lead accordingly. So we'll get to practices here in a few minutes, but that's principle #1 is identity precedes strategy. The second is story. So the second is that story is ultimately, and I want to refine even how I go about saying this. Every single aspect of our identity needs to be able to be conveyed in story. And the way that we do this, so now talking about practice, but the principle is really the story is what allows for our identity to be memorable, it to emotionally resonate with the other party hearing this, and it allows for us to be differentiated from our competitors. Story is what is uniquely ours. So our identity, the who we are, needs to be rooted in story. And so identity is principle #1 of what constitutes a strong brand, and story is principle #2, because the story is ultimately kind of the bridge that connects us between our audience and ourselves. If we think about authenticity and who we are on one side of the bridge, and then the empathy with which we extend to our audience, they're on the other side. The story is really the connector. It's really the bridge that allows for the two parties to meet. And then ultimately the handshake that occurs is on whatever platform we're engaging with them on. So that's really where the practice comes in. But the principles of authenticity, of story, and then the third principle of a strong brand, which is empathy. This is where it's, we start with kind of the professional here. We're talking about building a strong brand, but it lends so much into the personal, because we're not isolated creatures. We don't show up one way, at least we're not supposed to show up one way at work versus at home, because the more we're able to lead from an authentic presence, the more consistent we're going to be at every single touch point of our own lives. We talk about the consistency of the customer journey. Well, are we consistent at every touch point of our own lives? And so with that, the third principle is empathy. So we've got the authenticity, we've got the story, and then third principle is empathy, being able to allow for us to come focus on our identity, know who we are, come forward with authenticity, having the stories that ground us, that allow for emotional connection. And y'all, this is empathy protects us from narcissism, because otherwise, if we're solely focused on our identity, we're solely focused on presenting ourselves authentically, we're focused on our stories and our why, knowing who we are at our core level. Empathy is what allows us to then look outward rather than solely looking inward, because that's where the danger lies for most people who are either codependent. They're solely focused on the external, but those who are narcissists are solely focused internal. So it's almost, think of it as like a cross. You've got the vertical, which is the identity and the story, knowing who we are, and then the horizontal comes in, and this is the empathy. This allows for us to then ensure that we're engaging with the world in a manner that allows for true, meaningful connection, which is what every single human being wants. But that connection is at the intersection of authenticity and empathy. So we need to ensure that we're moving through the principles of what constitutes a strong brand, not just for our brand on the professional front, but also for our brand at home. Who are you to your children? Who are you to your spouse? Who are you to your partner? Who do they say that you are versus who your employees say that you are, who your customers say that you are? Is there congruency at every single touch point and in every regard? So those are really the three core principles of a strong core brand: is authenticity, knowing your identity. Identity precedes strategy. That's principle number one. Number two, your identity is rooted in story. And number three, empathy grounds you in the external manifestation of the brand, and it protects you at the end of the day from narcissism. So in terms of practice, right? So let's talk about the practice of identity, the practice of story, and the practice of empathy. The practice of authenticity. So this is actually something that I talked about the other day. I had, when I was at the Knowing Retreat, I ended up having folks send a text message. So the Knowing Retreat, for those of you who don't know, the Knowing Retreat is actually something that I first started in June of last year. And it was 9 to 10 people coming to we were actually gathered at a manor house. Each retreat, we hosted it at various locations. But for the first one, we hosted it at a manor house in Northern Virginia. It was absolutely beautiful alongside a vineyard. And people just came and stayed for about 4 nights. It was 4 nights. And we stayed for 2 full days of just doing the work. We started with a knowing dinner the night before where everyone got to know each other. Knowing dinners are something I began last year as well. And I just pose a question. I gather people who I know want to have we talk about emotional connection. That is what we crave, not just staying at the high level, but going deep beneath the surface so that we're truly having a meaningful connection and conversation. And so these knowing dinners are gathering people and souls around a dinner table and then having a question posed that allows for each one to go deep, and then affording time and space for every single person to answer. And these dinners have taken a couple of hours. Like they are not fast, especially with the number of people. But anyway, so we start the retreat with a knowing dinner. And then the next 2 days are what I liken to boot camp of the soul, where every single person knows that we're going deep. We're not going to allow any surface answers. We're going to ask why until we get to the root and the genesis of the pre-existing belief or behavior, whatever is in question. And so with this process, with this retreat, I had everyone in attendance send out a text message to those closest to them. And actually, let me go ahead and read to you what it is that we sent out to people. So first we had to give context, and this is what it said. It said, "Hello, I am at the Knowing Retreat, and we are examining how often we show up in relationships from a place of emotional health and safety. We are texting a few people with 2 questions. But first, what I mean by emotional health and safety. 1, I'm open to meeting my own needs, or I'm meeting my own needs. 2, I am operating from a place of full alignment with who I am uniquely. I'm not coming from a place of lack. I'm not looking to you to meet my needs. I am whole alone, and you and others close to me are truly an addition to my life. And second, below are the 2 questions. If you wouldn't mind helping me answer this, I'd greatly appreciate it. Number 1, what behaviors or temperaments show up when I'm acting from this place of health and safety? For example, am I easygoing? Am I goofy? Am I motivated? Am I driven? Number 2, what percentage of the time do you believe I act from this place? And so for those of you who are just joining, we're talking about when what are the 3 principles of a strong brand, and then what are the 3 practices? And so the first principle is identity precedes strategy. And so in order to know who we are, to be led from within, we have to do a self-audit. We have to know who we are. And this is a great question that I have actually, not just in the Knowing Retreats, but also when I was teaching a digital marketer course, I actually had folks text people out and say, hey, what do you think I do? And so it touches for the personal and the professional. How well do those close to you know you? How would they describe you, both in a professional and personal setting? And again, with the whole concept of congruency, are you congruent across every level of analysis? Do the people in the professional setting, do they feel like they know you, your values, what your services are? Does your family, how would they describe your health, your emotional health? How would they describe what that looks like? And then also the percentage of time. And then weigh that against your own answers. So often we do not actually take time to do a self-audit. Am I actually living my life in accordance with who I say I want to be? Because then I either need to change what I say or change the behavior. I need to change the belief, the core belief of who I think I want to be, and then thus say who I want to be, or change the behavior. And so with that, what that really, really allows for us when we're seeking to strengthen our identity, when we're seeking to strengthen who we know ourselves to be, we can ask others for their input, but ultimately, and this is where the knowing framework comes in, a core practice of really being able to know, who am I? What's my identity? We have to do the work to go back. And there's 3 steps in the knowing framework. One is to know, who was I? What are the stories? What are the experiences in childhood? I actually, just this weekend, I asked my dad, what's your earliest childhood memory? And he came back and said, which he was like 16 or 18 months, probably 18 months, because he was walking at the time. I guess he could have been walking at 16 months, but I think he was a little bit older. So he was 18 months old, and his earliest memory is his dad coming out of the basement, and he had like a pantyhose sock on his head. And so his face was all like smushed in, and he was trying to like play with my dad, but my dad freaked out and ran screaming and like climbed into his crib. And that's his earliest memory, was like being terrified and petrified of his father. And y'all, those memories cement something in us about the person, about the world, about ourselves. And so one of the surest ways to really understand who am I today is to understand the past. Who am I in the present is to understand who we were in the past, and understand the memories associated with the narratives that now hold a lot of weight, because only then can we take the narrative, pull it out of the kind of the recesses of our mind, pull it under the spotlight of our consciousness, and say, do I want to live in accordance with that? Is that narrative, is that belief in alignment with my ideal? So first we have to know, who was I? Then we have to know, how does that show up today in the present? Who am I? Who am I today? And so this audit of asking people close to us, hey, who do you think I am? How do I show up when I'm healthy? What are my values? What do you think I do for a living? Like, just getting a full rounded assessment from those closest to us, both professionally and personally, and then doing it for ourselves. So using this knowing framework of going back into the past and saying, who was I? What are the core memories and then beliefs that were established as a result of each one of those memories? How does that show up today? And then what's my ideal? Who do I want to be? And then am I on the right trajectory or not? So each one of those practices is really helpful in terms of identifying our identity. And that lends into principle number 2. So principle number 2 of what constitutes a strong brand is to have stories associated with our kind of like our core why. So when it comes to our identity and people are like, Christene, who are you? I say I really value emotional intelligence, and I actually have a story associated with that, right? My entire marriage and future fell apart because of a lack of emotional intelligence, and therefore I am deeply committed to only working with people who value emotional intelligence, only aligning myself with people who are in the pursuit of emotional health. And so now this value that I hold when people are like, hey, who are you? Like, what do you care about? And I say, I care about emotional intelligence. Well, now I've got a story associated with it, one that they may emotionally resonate with. And that's going to cement who I am deeper in their recesses. People remember stories 22 times more than they remember facts. And so the more stories we have associated with what we say, the more people are going to resonate, the more people are actually going to remember. And then third, when it comes to empathy, y'all take time to really understand your clients. Take them out to lunch. Y'all, that is foreign today. People do not engage personally, especially with AI coming in. When we think about AI and this new intelligence, AI is taking over, the automated intelligence is taking over kind of our natural intellect. And this automation, this artificial intelligence is really coming in, and it's replacing kind of this part of us that that's really garnered the most attention. All of our childhood education is dedicated to nurturing and cultivating this intellect. But now we've got this new intelligence coming in. And so what's left? Well, we haven't cultivated emotional intelligence, but we do have that. Each one of us has the ability to cultivate emotional intelligence. My hearing is falling out. Each one of us has the ability to cultivate emotional intelligence. And so with artificial intelligence coming in and taking away kind of the roles and jobs and areas that we've really had to foster to allow for us to make our way in the world, what's left? Emotional intelligence. And so, y'all, the more we can cultivate the empathy with our customer, the emotional connection, the more bought in they're going to be to you and your service than ever before, especially when they pick up the phone and then they hear an AI-driven robot, using whatever tool they're using on the back end. If they're not talking to a real person, a lot of people are still looking. Most people are looking for emotional connection, whether they realize it or not. And I'm sure all of us have felt the sigh, the frustration when they pick up the phone and try to call the airline to switch their ticket, and they just cannot get to a real person. So, y'all, the more you're leading from a place of identity, from a place of story, the more emotional connection your audience is going to feel, especially if you've done your work and you've actually taken the time to engage with them with empathy. And one of the fastest, surest ways to do that is to pick up the phone and call the customer or send out a survey. That's really, really easy to do. And you can ask them feeling-led questions. And when I say feeling-led questions, it's not just about garnering data, it's about garnering an understanding of their emotional transformation that they go through when working with you, because emotional transformation is what sells. 95% of our purchase decisions take place in our subconscious, which is where our emotions live. We have to be leading with emotion at every single touch point of the customer journey, backed by data of, okay, this button works better than this other button, whether it's the color, whether it's the text, whether it's the placement. Ultimately, do you know what moves the needle emotionally and logically for your customer based on the data that you're finding? So with that, those are the three core principles of what constitutes a strong brand: identity, story, and empathy. And then the three core practices that support each one. So thank you, my friends. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk with you soon.